Tonight we're going to Austin, Texas in the year 1885. A city that was building itself into something modern. A new state capital was rising from the ground, and the streets were filling with the kind of ambition that comes when a place believes its best years are still ahead of it. But underneath all of that, something was moving through the streets at night. Over the course of a single year, 8 people were murdered in their beds. The victims included servant women, an 11-year-old girl, a young couple, and on Christmas Eve, 2 women from the wealthiest part of town. They were struck with axes while they slept, dragged into backyards, and left mutilated and posed in ways that no one at the time could explain. And the killer left other details behind that made even less sense. Sharp objects were driven into his victims' ears. A child witness was covered with a blanket and told to be quiet. A stolen watch was placed on a dead woman's wrist. Pieces of wood were laid across a body like a cross. 400 men were arrested over the course of the investigation, and not one of them was ever convicted. The killings stopped as suddenly as they started, and then, 3 years later, a nearly identical string of murders began in London, committed by a man the world would come to know as Jack the Ripper. In the first half of this video, we'll go through exactly what happened during that year in Austin, from the first murder to the last, and the investigation that collapsed around it. In the second half, we'll look at what the killer's behavior might reveal about the kind of mind that did this, what the escalation pattern, the ritual details, and the things he did to the bodies can tell us about who he was and what was driving him. This is the story of the servant girl annihilator. Austin, Texas in 1884 was a city in the middle of becoming something. It had a population of around 17,000 people, which made it small by the standards of the American East, but by Texas standards it was growing fast. A new state capitol building was under construction, an enormous project that would take years to complete, and that had drawn workers from across the state and beyond. There were 3 colleges, there was an opera house. Congress Avenue, the city's main thoroughfare, was lined with brick and mortar storefronts that had replaced the old wood frame buildings from the frontier days. Carriages moved down dirt streets at a slow trot. Cowboys still rode in from the surrounding ranches to drink and raise hell on the weekends. And the telephone had only recently arrived, operated by a handful of young women known as Hello Girls, who sat at the downtown exchange and connected every call in the city by hand. Austin was not yet a modern city, but it believed it was on its way to becoming one. Beneath that ambition, though, was a structure that no amount of new construction could disguise. The city was deeply segregated, not just by law, but by the physical arrangement of daily life. Wealthy white families lived in large homes on the city's better streets, and behind those homes in the backyards were small wooden cabins, sometimes barely more than shacks, where black domestic servants lived and worked. These women cooked the meals, cleaned the houses, and raised the children of their employers. They earned around $10 to $12 a month, and in exchange they were given a room in the backyard and whatever food was left over at the end of the day. They were essential to the functioning of every household they served, and they were almost entirely invisible to the city around them. Many of these servants had come to Austin from the freedmen's communities that had grown up in and around the city after the Civil War. One of the oldest was Wheatville, founded by a former slave named James Wheat on the western edge of town. These communities were close-knit and self-sustaining, but they existed in the shadow of a white power structure that paid very little attention to what happened inside them, unless something went wrong. The Austin Police Department consisted of 12 men. Their chief was a young city marshal named Groomsley. The department's lead investigator, and essentially its only detective, was Sergeant John Chenville, a former cabin boy on a Confederate ship during the Civil War who had come to Austin in the 1870s and built a reputation as the most industrious officer on the force. Chenville was known for riding his horse through downtown at least twice a day, keeping his back perfectly straight, and for maintaining a network of informers who kept him aware of the city's criminal activity. But the crimes he investigated were almost always straightforward, a drunken argument that turned into a stabbing. A personal grudge settled with a pistol in a saloon. Nearly every murder had an eyewitness, and the killer was usually still standing there when the police arrived. The department had no forensic tools, no system for recording fingerprints, no understanding of blood spatter or crime scene analysis. The closest thing Chenville had to investigative technology was a pair of bloodhounds that lived in his backyard and trotted behind his horse when he needed them. This was the city that existed on the night of the 30th of December, 1884. A place that was building opera houses and colleges, but whose police force had never dealt with anything more complicated than a barroom killing. A place where 17,000 people slept with their doors unlocked and their windows open on warm nights. A place where dozens of black women slept alone in backyard cabins, separated from the rest of the household by nothing more than a thin wooden door. No one in Austin had ever heard the term serial killer. The concept didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be named for nearly another century. And no one had any reason to believe they would need it. A few days before the end of 1884, a storm swept down from the Canadian Rockies and tore across the Great Plains. By the time it reached Austin in the early morning hours of the 31st of December, New Year's Eve, the temperature had dropped by 30 degrees. Ice bounced off rooftops, wind knifed through the cracks in the houses, the streets were empty and black. Mollie Smith was 25 years old. She worked as a cook and maid for William Hall, an insurance agent who lived in one of the nicer homes on West Pecan Street. She cleaned the house, prepared the meals, and worked 6 days a week in exchange for $10 to $12 a month and a place to stay. That place was a tiny one-room cabin in the Hall's backyard. She shared it with her boyfriend, Walter Spencer, a 29-year-old laborer at Butler's brick yard, where he carried 500 bricks a day to the wagons for 75 cents. On the night of the 30th of December, the Hall family was out of town. Hall and his wife had gone to Galveston to visit friends for the holidays. The only people staying in the main house were Hall's brother-in-law, Tom Chalmers, a former Texas Ranger, and his wife. Mollie and Walter went to bed in their cabin sometime that evening. At some point during the night, someone entered the room while they slept. Walter Spencer was struck in the head and knocked unconscious. When he came to, he was alone. Blood was running from several deep gashes in his skull, and Mollie was gone. Spencer searched the cabin. He searched the backyard. He went out into the street, but without a lantern and in total darkness, he couldn't see anything. He made his way to the main house and knocked on the front door. Tom Chalmers heard a voice from outside saying, "Help me." When Chalmers lit a match, he saw Spencer standing in the foyer, barefoot, wearing only a nightshirt, wobbling like a man who couldn't keep his balance. Spencer told Chalmers that someone had attacked him in his sleep and that Mollie was missing. He begged Chalmers to help him find her. Chalmers was not inclined to go outside in freezing weather to search for a black man's missing girlfriend. He told Spencer to bandage his head, escorted him out of the house, shut the door, and went back to bed. It wasn't until after sunrise that anyone found Mollie. A black man who worked for one of the Hall's neighbors stepped into the back alley to collect firewood. He looked down the alley and saw what he first thought was a dead animal lying on the ground behind the outhouse. He noticed the scrap of a nightdress, the legs, then he started screaming. Mollie Smith had been dragged from her cabin to the alley behind the outhouse. She had been struck in the head with an axe, stabbed repeatedly, and left in the open. From the way her body was positioned, it was clear that the attack had been sexual as well as violent. Back inside the cabin, police found the bed soaked through with blood, several pieces of furniture overturned, a mirror knocked to the floor and shattered, and a blood-stained axe at the foot of the bed. On the wall near the door to the backyard, there was a single bloody handprint. Officer William Howe was the first policeman on the scene. He was a young patrolman in his mid-20s who mostly handed out tickets for unhitched horses and arrested drunks outside the downtown saloons. He had never investigated a murder. Sergeant Chenville arrived later that morning on his bay horse, his bloodhounds trotting behind him. Chenville had seen plenty of dead bodies in his career. He had watched men hanged behind the county courthouse. He had investigated knife fights and shootings in saloons, but he had never seen anything like this. The bloodhounds were led to the body and then brought inside the cabin to try to pick up a scent. They didn't take a single trail. Cheneville's only laid was a man named William Lem Brooks, an ex-boyfriend of Mollie's who had followed her to Austin from Waco after she had ended their relationship. Brooks had reportedly been upset when he discovered Mollie was now with Walter Spencer, and there had been a confrontation between the two men. Officers found Brooks asleep at his new girlfriend's house. He said he had been working as a prompter at a dance at Sand Hill, a black meeting hall on the east side of town, 2 miles from the Hall residence. Cheneville arrested him anyway on suspicion of murder and had him thrown in the city jail. Nobody else was questioned, nobody else seemed like a plausible suspect. Meanwhile, Tom Chalmers cleaned the blood off the walls and floor of the cabin. He threw out Mollie's clothes and discarded the broken mirror. He wanted everything to be perfectly spotless by the time his brother-in-law returned from Galveston. He wanted it to look as if nothing had happened there at all. Lem Brooks was eventually released for lack of evidence. Walter Spencer was briefly considered as a suspect, but those who knew him said he and Mollie had been on the best of terms and that he generally did everything she asked of him. No one was charged with the murder of Mollie Smith. For a time, Austin settled back into its routine. One killing, even a brutal one, didn't necessarily mean anything larger was happening. People had seen violence before. This was still Texas. 5 months passed without another attack, and then it happened again. On the night of the 6th of May, 1885, 5 months after the murder of Mollie Smith, the killer returned. Eliza Shelley was about 30 years old. She worked as a cook for Dr. Lucian Johnson, a medical doctor and former state legislator who lived with his wife and niece on Cypress Street. Eliza lived in a small cabin behind the Johnson home with her 3 young boys. Her husband was in the state penitentiary at Huntsville. Dr. Johnson and his wife would later describe Eliza as an excellent woman, faithful, reliable, and honest. They said they had treated her more like family than a servant. Sometime in the middle of the night, someone entered her cabin. Around 6 the following morning, Mrs. Johnson heard the children screaming. She sent her teenage niece to check on them. The girl came running back moments later, so terrified that she couldn't speak. When Dr. Johnson went out to the cabin and opened the door, he found Eliza's 3 boys huddled in a corner of the room. Eliza was on the floor next to the bed, covered with a blanket. She had been struck in the head with an axe, stabbed repeatedly with a knife, and from the way her body was positioned, investigators believed she had been sexually assaulted. Between her eyes was a small puncture wound that appeared to have been made by a thin iron rod. Sergeant Cheneville arrived and set his bloodhounds to work. They found what were described as large, broad, barefoot tracks leading to and from the cabin, but they could not pick up a scent. Eliza's 7-year-old son was the only witness. He told the police that he had been shaken awake in the middle of the night by a man wearing a white rag over his face with 2 holes cut out for eyes. The man told the boy to put his head under a pillow and not to look up, or he would kill him. Then the man said he was leaving for St. Louis on the first train in the morning. The boy said he fell asleep after that. His 2 younger brothers had never woken up. The police did not believe a 7-year-old could have slept through his mother's murder, but every time they asked him what happened, he repeated the same story. No one was charged. And then only 16 days later, it happened again. On the night of the 22nd of May, Irene Cross was attacked in her cabin on Linden Street, across from Skull's Garden, a beer garden on the city's south side. Irene was about 38 years old. She was a widow who lived with her grown son, Washington, and her 12-year-old nephew, Douglas Brown. Washington was not home that night. The boys slept in one room, Irene slept in the other. Douglas told the police that he had opened his eyes in the middle of the night to see the dark figure of a man coming through his door. The man was holding a knife. He quietly told Douglas he wasn't there to hurt him and warned the boy not to scream. Then the man went into Irene's bedroom. A few minutes later, the man left. When Irene was found, she had been stabbed so severely that a reporter at the scene said it looked as if someone had tried to scalp her. A reporter was able to speak with Irene before she died. She held on for 3 days. Douglas Brown gave the only physical description of the killer that anyone had heard so far. He described the man as a big, chunky Negro man, barefooted with his pants rolled up. It was a detail that would become important later. though no one knew it yet. Again, no one was charged. The city of Austin was beginning to understand that these were not isolated events. 3 black servant women had now been attacked in their beds in the middle of the night. 2 of them were dead and the third was dying. In each case, the killer had entered the cabin undetected. In each case, a child witness had been left alive. In each case, the bloodhounds had failed. But the worst was still to come. On the night of the 30th of August, the killer attacked the home of Valentine Weed on East Cedar Street. Rebecca Ramey worked as a domestic servant for the Weed family. She was a large, sturdy woman in her 40s. Her 11-year-old daughter, Mary, lived with her. That summer, like so many other servant women across Austin, Rebecca had been too frightened to sleep in the backyard cabin. She and Mary had been sleeping on pallets in the Weeds' kitchen instead, but it didn't matter. In the middle of the night, Rebecca woke to see a dark silhouette standing over her. She was struck in the head and knocked unconscious. When the Weeds found her the next morning, she was barely able to move or speak, and Mary was gone. Valentine Weed grabbed his gun and went to the backyard shed with a neighbor. When they opened the door, Mary was lying on the floor. Her eyes were partly open. Blood was trickling from her ears and nose. Dr. Johnson, the same Dr. Johnson who had employed Eliza Shelley, arrived with another physician. They examined the girl and realized there was nothing they could do. Dr. Johnson cradled Mary's head until she died, just as dawn arrived. Mary Ramey was 11 years old. She had grown up on Pecan Street, where her uncle Edward Carrington ran one of the first black-owned businesses in Austin, a grocery store that also served as an informal community center. She had been the baby of the family, known and loved by the neighbors and the regular customers who came through the store. A newspaper would later report that her mother, Rebecca, never recovered from the shock and the wounds of that terrible night. After the murder of Mary Ramey, the city of Austin was no longer unsettled. It was afraid. Editorials demanded new leadership. Citizens talked openly about forming vigilance committees. Shotguns were loaded and kept by the door. And for the first time, some of the police officers began to talk openly about what a reporter had already suggested, that these killings were not the work of separate criminals with separate motives, but the work of one man. A reporter for the San Antonio Daily Express had given him a name, and that was the Midnight Assassin. By the end of September 1885, 4 women had been murdered and 2 more had been seriously injured. Every victim had been a black servant. Every attack had come in the middle of the night, and every time the killer had vanished without a trace. But on the night of the 28th of September, something changed. For the first time, the killer didn't get away cleanly. For the first time, someone saw him and lived to describe what happened. Gracie Vance was about 20 years old. She worked as a cook for William Dunham, a journalist for the Texas Court Reporter, and lived in a small cabin behind Dunham's property on Guadalupe Street, just past the University of Texas. She shared the cabin with her boyfriend, Orange Washington, who worked as a laborer for a local builder. 2 friends, Lucinda Body, 17, and Patsy Gibson, also 17, were staying with them that night. 4 people were asleep in the cabin when the killer came through the window. He moved fast. Orange Washington was struck twice in the head with an axe and killed. Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson were each struck in the head and left for dead. Gracie was dragged out of the cabin and into the yard. Dunham, sleeping in the main house, was woken by a noise from the servants' quarters. He assumed it was Gracie and Orange arguing. They had quarreled earlier that evening, and shouted at them to be quiet from the back door. Several minutes later, he heard a groan. He grabbed his pistol and stepped outside. At that moment, Lucinda Body stumbled out of the cabin, blood running from her head, and screamed, "Mr. Dunham, we're all dead." Dunham's neighbor ran out with a lantern. They entered the cabin and found Orange Washington lying face down on the floor between the bed and the wall, in a pool of blood. A bloody axe was on the bedspread next to him. Patsy Gibson was unconscious on the bed, barely alive. Gracie was nowhere to be found. 2 police officers arrived and used their lanterns to follow a trail of blood from the cabin into a neighboring yard that was being used as a small horse pasture. As they approached the stable, one of them stumbled over something on the ground. It was Gracie. She had been beaten with a brick so severely that her face was unrecognizable. She had been assaulted and left in the dirt next to the stable. Beside her body was a blood-covered brick. And on her wrist, wrapped around her arm, was a silver open-faced watch that didn't belong to her. That same morning, a man named John Robinson arrived at the police station with his Swedish teenage servant girl. She told officers that someone had broken into her quarters during the night, scattered her belongings, and stolen the only thing of value she owned, a silver open-faced watch her father had given her in Sweden. When officers brought her the watch found on Gracie Vance's wrist, the girl flipped it over. Engraved on the back was her name. She said she had no idea who Gracie Vance was. There was a long silence in the room as the men at the police station looked at one another, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. The killer had broken into one home, stolen a watch from a sleeping woman, and then carried it with him to the next attack, where he placed it on the wrist of the woman he had just murdered. No one could explain why. But what had happened inside the cabin was not the only thing that set this attack apart. Lucinda Body had regained consciousness during the assault. She had picked up a kerosene lantern and looked around the room. Orange Washington was on the floor, and there was a man standing in the cabin with her. He looked at her and said, "Don't look at me." He cursed at her and told her to put out the light. She threw the lantern at him and ran. It was the first time anyone had confronted the killer and survived. But Lucinda's description was confused, and in the chaos of the night, she was unable to give police a clear account of what the man looked like. The police arrested 2 black men from the area, Doc Woods, whom Lucinda had identified, and his friend Oliver Townsend, who had been heard threatening Gracie Vance. Woods was found with a bloody shirt in his possession. Neither man was ever convicted. After the attack on Gracie Vance's household, some of the pretense fell away. This was not a series of unrelated domestic disputes. This was not jealous lovers or drunken arguments that had gone too far. 4 people had been attacked simultaneously in a single cabin by someone who came through the window in the dark and moved through the room with terrifying efficiency. A reporter wrote that the killer was one of the most remarkable ghouls known to the death history of any section of the country. For the first time, the newspapers used the phrase that had been circulating for weeks, the midnight assassin. Older members of Austin's black community began lighting candles in their windows at night. Some believed the killer was a white man with supernatural powers who could make himself invisible, because no dog in any yard near any of the crime scenes had ever been heard to bark. The police had no answer for that. They had no answer for any of it. And they were about to find out that the midnight assassin was not finished. For nearly 3 months after the attack on Gracie Vance's household, there were no more murders. The city remained on edge. Servant women refused to sleep in their backyard cabins. Families kept guns by the door. The newspapers continued to print editorials demanding that the police do something, anything, to find the man responsible. But as the weeks passed without another attack, some people allowed themselves to believe it might be over, but it wasn't. On the night of the 24th of December, 1885, Christmas Eve, the midnight assassin struck twice in a single hour, and for the first time, the victims were white. Moses and Susan Hancock lived on Water Street in the southern part of the city, near the Colorado River. Moses was a carpenter in his early 50s. Susan was about 45. They had 2 daughters, Lena, who was 16, and Ida, who was 11. That evening, the girls had gone to a Christmas party. Moses and Susan sat by the fireplace reading and sharing a piece of cake. They went to bed around 10, sleeping in separate rooms, as was common for the time. The girls came home a little after 11. A gas lamp was left burning by the front door. Sometime around midnight, Moses woke to a loud noise. He went into Susan's room and found the bedding on the floor, her clothes scattered, and the window open. He walked to the backyard and found his wife lying in the dirt. She had been struck in the head with an axe and dragged from her bed through the window. A thin rod of some kind had been driven into her ear, the same type of wound that had been found on Mary Ramey months earlier. Susan was still breathing, but barely. Moses and a neighbor carried her into the parlor. A physician arrived and began pressing bandages to her head while giving her morphine to ease the pain. Marshal James Lucy, who had recently replaced the ineffective Grooms Lay as the city's chief of police, arrived at the scene along with a newspaper reporter, the mayor, and the district attorney. Within minutes, the Hancock's lawn was filled with men. And then, as officers were still searching the backyard for evidence, a night clerk from the police department came riding up on horseback at full speed. He was shouting, "It's Eula Phillips. Her head has been chopped in two." Eula Phillips was 17 years old. She had been married at 14 or 15 to Jimmy Phillips, the 24-year-old son of a successful Austin architect. She was frequently described as one of the most beautiful young women in the city. The couple lived at the Phillips family home on Hickory Street, in one of the wealthier neighborhoods in Austin. They had an infant son, Thomas, who was about 18 months old. Their marriage had been troubled. Jimmy drank heavily and was prone to jealousy. Eula had been deeply unhappy and had been involved with at least one other man, a prominent young official connected to the construction of the new state capitol building. On Christmas Eve, after the rest of the household had gone to sleep, Eula had quietly slipped out of the house. She went to the home of May Taubin, a woman who ran what was known as an assignation house, a private residence where rooms could be rented by the hour for romantic encounters. Eula asked for a room, but none were available. She left, and within an hour she was dead. When Marshal Lucy and the other men arrived at the Phillips home, they were led to the backyard. Eula's body was lying next to the outhouse. She had been struck in the head with an axe, dragged from the bedroom, and left in the alley. 3 pieces of firewood had been placed across her body, 2 across her chest, and 1 across her stomach. Her arms were outstretched. It looked deliberate. It looked posed. Inside the house, Jimmy Phillips was lying in bed with a severe wound above his ear. He was barely conscious and unable to speak. A bloody axe was at the foot of the bed. The couple's infant son, Thomas, was sitting up next to his father. He was unharmed, though his clothes were covered in blood. He was clutching a piece of apple. Someone, presumably the killer, had given the child the apple. A bloody bare footprint had been left on the wooden floor in the hallway outside the bedroom, right next to the door leading to the backyard. Marshal Lucy ordered the floorboards containing the print to be removed and taken to the police station. Susan Hancock held on for 3 days. She died on the 28th of December without ever regaining consciousness. Eula Phillips was already gone. 2 white women murdered on the same night, in the same hour, in the same city that had spent the past year watching black servant women die in their beds without ever catching the man responsible. By Christmas morning, the news had spread to every household in Austin. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. One newspaper ran the headline, "Blood, Blood, Blood," across the front page. Gun shops sold out of firearms and ammunition within hours. Citizens flooded a public meeting, 500 people in a single room, demanding that something be done. Vigilance committees were organized, a curfew was enacted, saloons were forced to close at midnight, the police force was expanded, strangers were stopped on the streets and forced to identify themselves or leave the city. And for the first time, the case made national news. The New York Times ran a front-page article on the 26th of December, reporting that the murders had been committed by some cunning madman who was insane on the subject of killing women. The African-American community, which had been burying its dead for an entire year with almost no attention from the white power structure, watched the city's sudden panic with something between grief and bitter recognition. When the victims had been black servants, the response had been bloodhounds and shrugged shoulders. Now that the victims were white, Austin was tearing itself apart. But the fear at least was shared, and one question hung over the entire city as 1885 came to a close. If the killer could enter any home in any neighborhood and murder anyone, regardless of race or wealth or locked doors, then no one in Austin was safe. And no one knew if he was finished. After Christmas Eve, the murders stopped. There were no more attacks in January, none in February, none in the months that followed. The midnight assassin, whoever he was, had gone silent. But the investigation that followed would prove to be almost as damaging as the crimes themselves. Over the course of 1885, approximately 400 men had been arrested in connection with the murders. The vast majority of them were young black men who had been rounded up for no reason other than proximity, poverty, or the color of their skin. Some of them were dragged from their homes, some were picked up off the streets for the crime of being barefoot, some were thrown into jail cells simply because a bloodhound had wandered in their direction. Outside detectives were brought in to assist the Austin police, and their methods were no better. In at least one case, suspects were beaten during interrogation. In another, a man was threatened with lynching unless he confessed. None of these arrests produced a credible suspect. None of them brought the city any closer to understanding who had been killing its women for the past year. And when the two white women were murdered on Christmas Eve, the investigation took a different turn entirely. Rather than connecting the deaths of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips to the murders that had come before, the authorities did something that now seems almost incomprehensible. They charged the victims' husbands. The theory was straightforward. Moses Hancock, they said, had found out his wife was thinking of leaving him because of his drinking. He had killed her in a rage and staged the scene to look like the work of the midnight assassin. Jimmy Phillips, they said, had discovered that his wife was having affairs. He had killed Eula with an axe, dragged her body outside, placed the pieces of wood across her to mimic the earlier murders, and then struck himself in the head to make it look like he had been attacked too. Two separate husbands, acting independently on the same night, at the same hour, committing nearly identical murders and staging them in nearly identical ways. Even at the time, people found this difficult to believe. Jimmy Phillips was tried first, in May of 1886. Over 3 days, friends and family were brought in to testify about the state of the marriage. The prosecution painted Eula as an unfaithful wife and Jimmy as a violently jealous husband. Witnesses described his drinking and his temper. The testimony about Eula's affairs, her visits to May Taubin's assignation house, her involvement with the prominent young official, became a public scandal that embarrassed several of Austin's most powerful men. The only physical evidence was the bloody footprint found on the floor of the Phillips home. In a dramatic moment in the courtroom, Jimmy Phillips was ordered to remove his shoes, place his foot in a bucket of ink, and step onto a pine board so that his print could be compared to the one found at the scene. His foot was smaller than the print. The prosecution argued that the weight of carrying Eula's body would have caused his feet to spread, making a larger impression. Phillips was ordered to pick up his own defense attorney to demonstrate the point. It still didn't match. The jury convicted him anyway. He was sentenced to 7 years. His attorneys appealed. The Texas Court of Appeals reviewed the case and overturned the conviction, ruling that the prosecution had presented no direct evidence that Phillips had known about his wife's infidelity and therefore had no established motive. The case was sent back to the district court, and the charges were eventually dismissed. Moses Hancock went to trial in June of 1887. His case was weaker than Phillips. Hancock's 16-year-old daughter, Lena, took the stand and told the court that her father had always treated her mother kindly and had never hit her or her sister. The prosecution's key piece of evidence was a letter Susan had written but never sent, in which she told Moses she was leaving him because of his drinking. But Lena testified that her mother had hidden the letter at the bottom of a box of fake flowers and had never found the courage to show it to Moses. He had no idea the letter existed. It was during the Hancock trial that the most significant piece of evidence in the entire case was finally introduced, not by the prosecution, but by the defense. Travis County Sheriff Malcolm Hornsby took the witness stand and told the court something that had not been made public before. On the 9th of February, 1886, a little over 6 weeks after the Christmas Eve murders, a young black man named Nathan Elgin had gotten into a violent confrontation at a saloon in Masontown, a small community just east of the Austin city limits. Elgin had dragged a young woman from the saloon and was beating her in a nearby house. When a police officer arrived and tried to handcuff him, Elgin knocked the officer to the ground and pulled a knife. The officer drew his pistol and fired. Elgin was hit in the chest. The bullet lodged in his spine. He was paralyzed and he died the following day. During the autopsy, doctors noticed something. Nathan Elgin was missing a toe from his right foot. Sheriff Hornsby told the court that throughout the investigation of the servant girl murders, the police had carefully noted the barefoot prints found at several of the crime scenes. They had kept one detail from the public and the press. The prints appeared to be missing a toe. After Elgin's death, Hornsby had ordered a plaster cast made of his foot. He compared it to the prints found at the Phillips home and at the scene of Mary Ramey's murder. In his opinion, they were consistent. Hornsby also told the court something else. Since Nathan Elgin's death, there had been no more murders. The jury in the Hancock case deliberated for 2 days. They could not reach a verdict. The judge declared a mistrial, and the charges against Moses Hancock were eventually dropped. Neither husband was ever convicted. But the revelation about Nathan Elgin raised a question that the authorities were not prepared to answer publicly. Had the midnight assassin been dead since February of 1886? Elgin had grown up in Austin, in the freedmen's community of Wheatville. He was 19 years old at the time of his death. He worked as a cook at one of the city's finer restaurants within close proximity to several of the crime scenes. He had a history of violence. As a teenager, he had been arrested for carrying a pistol and getting into a confrontation near the governor's mansion. In 1882, he had written a letter to a deputy sheriff threatening to whip, destroy, and kill him. The newspaper had described the letter as reckless and bloodthirsty. He was married with at least one child. His wife, Sally, had given birth on the night of the 24th of December, 1885, the same night Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips were murdered. The physical evidence was circumstantial but specific. The missing toe matched the prints. The geographic proximity matched the crime scenes. The timeline matched perfectly. The murders began while Elgin was active in Austin, and they ended when he died. But Elgin was never charged. He was never interrogated about the murders. He was never given the chance to confess or deny anything. He died on a floor in Masontown from a bullet in his spine, and whatever he knew about the events of 1885 died with him. The authorities never made a public statement about Elgin's possible connection to the case. The police files from the investigation were eventually destroyed. And so the case remained officially unsolved, but the story did not end there. On the 5th of September, 1888, nearly 3 years after the last murder in Austin, a woman was found dead in the Whitechapel district of London. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. She was the first confirmed victim of the man who would become known as Jack the Ripper. Within weeks, newspapers in Texas and across the United States began drawing connections between the murders in London and the murders in Austin. The methods were similar: the targeting of vulnerable women, the attacks in the middle of the night, the escalating brutality. A detective in London interviewed an English sailor who told him about a peculiar Malaysian man he had encountered in a local pub. The man had worked as a cook on steamships at the English ports and had threatened to murder and mutilate every woman in Whitechapel after being robbed by one of them. Upon further investigation, it was discovered that a Malaysian cook named Morris had worked at the Pearl House Hotel in Austin during 1885. Several of the crime scenes had been located just a few blocks from the hotel. Morris had left Austin in January of 1886, telling people he was heading to Galveston to find work on a steamer bound for England. London police were ordered to find him. They never did. The connection between the midnight assassin and Jack the Ripper was never proven. It may have been nothing more than coincidence and the human need to draw lines between terrible things. But the theory persisted, in part because the alternative was harder to accept: that two separate men, operating independently on two different continents, had carried out eerily similar campaigns of violence against women, and that neither of them was ever identified. In 1894, nearly a decade after the murders, the city of Austin purchased 31 Moonlight Towers from Detroit. Each tower stood 165 feet tall and weighed approximately 5,000 pounds. A ring of 6 high-powered carbon arc lamps sat on top of each one, casting an artificial glow across the surrounding streets. Other cities had installed similar towers above railroad depots and shopping districts. Austin placed them everywhere, across neighborhoods, over residential streets, in every part of the city. The purpose was never stated explicitly, but everyone understood. The midnight assassin had operated in darkness. Austin's response was to try to eliminate the darkness itself. Some residents worried that the artificial light would cause their crops to grow at unnatural rates, or that their hens would start laying eggs around the clock. Others carried umbrellas to protect themselves from the brightness. But the towers went up and they stayed up. Today, more than 140 years later, the Moonlight Towers are still standing. They are the only surviving towers of their kind anywhere in the world. In 1970, they were designated as Texas state landmarks. They are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Most people who walk past them have no idea why they're there. They were built because, for 1 year in the 1880s, something moved through the streets of Austin at night, and the city could not stop it. 8 people were murdered, hundreds were arrested, not a single person was ever convicted. And the case of the servant girl annihilator, the name given to the killer by the writer O. Henry, who was living in Austin at the time, was never officially closed. That's the story of what happened in Austin. The victims, the timeline, the investigation that never found its footing, and the suspects who were never convicted. But knowing what happened doesn't answer the deeper questions. Why did the killer drag his victims out of their beds and into the yard when it would have been safer to kill them where they lay? Why did he leave child witnesses alive when they could have identified him? Why did he drive iron rods into the ears of the women he murdered? Why did he steal a watch from one home and place it on the wrist of a woman he killed at another? And why did he lay pieces of wood across Eula Phillips' body like a cross? In part 2, we're going to go through the psychology behind this case. Not to solve it, that's no longer possible, but to understand what the killer's behavior might reveal about the kind of mind that did this. What the escalation pattern tells us about how he developed. What the ritual details suggest about what was driving him. What the things he did after the killing stopped can tell us about who he was. And why this case, after more than 140 years, still refuses to let go. One of the most revealing things about the servant girl annihilator is not what he did, but how what he did changed over time. The first attack, Mollie Smith, on the night of the 30th of December, 1884, was violent and disorganized. The cabin was left in chaos. Furniture was overturned. A mirror was smashed. The axe was left behind. Walter Spencer, who was sleeping in the same bed, was struck but not killed. The killer left a bloody handprint on the wall near the door. This is not the behavior of someone who is in control of what he is doing. In criminal psychology, there is a concept called the disorganized offender. It describes a killer whose crime scenes reflect impulsivity, emotional chaos, and a lack of planning. The attack is driven by rage or compulsion rather than strategy. The scene is messy. Evidence is left behind. The killer doesn't clean up, doesn't take precautions, and doesn't seem particularly concerned with getting away. The murder of Mollie Smith fits this profile almost exactly. The killer got in, attacked 2 people in a frenzy, dragged the woman outside, and left a trail of evidence behind him: the axe, the handprint, the blood, the footprints. If this had been the only attack, investigators might have been looking at a crime of passion, a one-time eruption from someone who knew the victim and lost control. But it wasn't the only attack. 5 months later, Eliza Shelley was killed. The method was similar: a nighttime entry, an axe to the head, a sexual assault, but the execution was different. This time, the killer controlled the child witness. He woke the boy, told him to put his head under a pillow, and warned him not to look. He even offered a false lead, telling the boy he was leaving for St. Louis in the morning. That is not impulsivity. That is someone thinking during the crime. Someone who has learned between the first attack and the second that there are things he needs to manage if he wants to continue. In behavioral analysis, this is called the evolution of modus operandi. Every killer who commits multiple offenses goes through a process of refinement. The first crime is the roughest because the killer is operating on impulse and fantasy without any practical experience. But with each subsequent offense, the things that work get repeated, and the things that created problems get corrected. Between Mollie Smith and Eliza Shelley, the killer learned that he needed to deal with the other people in the room. With Mollie Smith, he had simply attacked Walter Spencer and left him alive, a significant risk, because Spencer could have woken up at any point and fought back or raised an alarm. By the time of Eliza Shelley, the killer had developed a method for neutralizing witnesses without killing them. He used intimidation. He used commands, and it worked. The boy put his head under the pillow and didn't move. This same technique appeared again with Irene Cross, when the killer told 12-year-old Douglas Brown not to scream, and then calmly walked into the next room. And again on Christmas Eve, when the killer apparently gave Eula Phillips' infant son an apple to keep him quiet. The pattern is not random. It is a skill being developed in real time across multiple crime scenes. The escalation and boldness is equally revealing. Mollie Smith was a single woman in a cabin, attacked alongside one man. This is relatively low risk for the killer, one target, one potential obstacle in an isolated structure in a backyard. 5 months later, Eliza Shelley was attacked in a cabin with 3 children present. The risk is slightly higher, but the children are small and unlikely to resist. By the time the killer reached Gracie Vance's household on the 28th of September, he was confident enough to enter a cabin containing 4 people and attack all of them in rapid succession. He incapacitated 3 of them and dragged the 4th outside to complete the assault. This is an extraordinary escalation. Going from a single victim to 4 victims in one location requires a level of confidence and physical control that does not come from nowhere. It comes from having done this before and having succeeded every time. And then Christmas Eve, 2 separate homes, 2 separate victims, 2 separate murders committed within an hour of each other in different parts of the city. This is the most audacious attack in the entire series, and it tells us something critical about where the killer was psychologically by the end of 1885. He was not winding down, he was not becoming more cautious, he was accelerating. The cooling off periods, the gaps between attacks, confirm this. 5 months elapsed between Mollie Smith and Eliza Shelley, 16 days between Eliza Shelley and Irene Cross. 3 months between Irene Cross and Mary Ramey, less than a month between Mary Ramey and Gracie Vance, and less than 3 months between Gracie Vance and the Christmas Eve double murder. In the study of serial offenders, shortening cooling-off periods are one of the most reliable indicators that a killer is losing the ability to regulate his compulsion. The fantasy that drives the killing is demanding satisfaction more and more frequently. Each crime provides temporary relief, but the relief lasts for a shorter period each time, which pushes the killer toward his next offense sooner. By the 24th of December, 1885, the midnight assassin had reached a point where a single murder in a single night was no longer enough. He needed 2. And he was willing to cross the most dangerous boundary available to him to get them. Every previous victim had been a black servant woman. The killer had operated within a category that was, in the context of 1880s Austin, relatively low risk. The police paid less attention to crimes against black women. The investigations were minimal. The community's outrage was largely ignored by the white power structure. On Christmas Eve, the killer abandoned that safety margin entirely. He murdered 2 white women in the wealthiest part of the city. Some investigators have interpreted this as a deliberate choice, a killer who was intentionally escalating to more high-profile targets, but behavioral analysis suggests a different explanation. It is more likely that the killer's compulsion had simply outpaced his caution. The need to act had become so overwhelming that the practical risks, the increased police attention, the public outrage, the far greater likelihood of being caught, no longer factored into his decision-making. This is consistent with what researchers call the decompensation phase of serial offending. It is the point at which the internal pressure driving the killer becomes stronger than his ability to control it. The crimes become more frequent, more reckless, and more likely to result in his capture or death. If the killings had not stopped after Christmas Eve, whether because of Nathan Elgin's death or for some other reason, behavioral analysis would predict that the next attack would have come even sooner, been even bolder, and carried an even greater risk of the killer being caught. The midnight assassin was not a man who was going to stop on his own. Something stopped him, whether that something was a bullet in a saloon in Masontown, or imprisonment for an unrelated crime, or flight from the city, or something else entirely. The trajectory of his behavior points to a single conclusion. By the end of 1885, the killer was no longer in control of what he was doing. The violence was in control of him. In every murder attributed to the midnight assassin, the killing itself was only the beginning. After the victims were struck down, usually with an axe, usually while they slept, the killer did things that had nothing to do with causing death. He moved the bodies, he arranged them. He performed acts on them that served no practical purpose, and that, in some cases, no one has been able to explain in over 140 years. In forensic behavioral analysis, there is a critical distinction between what is called modus operandi and what is called signature behavior. Modus operandi is everything the killer does because he needs to. It is functional. Entering through a window is modus operandi. Striking the victim in the head while she sleeps is modus operandi. These are practical decisions that serve the goal of committing the crime without being caught. Signature behavior is different. It is everything the killer does that he doesn't need to. Actions that serve no strategic purpose, that don't help him carry out the attack or avoid detection, but that he performs anyway because something inside him requires it. The Midnight Assassin's signature behaviors are among the most distinctive and disturbing in the history of American criminal cases. The most consistent was the dragging. In 5 of the murders, the killer struck the victim inside the cabin and then dragged her, unconscious, but in some cases still alive, out of the building and into the yard. The killing was completed outdoors. The sexual assault occurred outdoors. The body was left outdoors. This is not efficient. It is not safe. Every second the killer spent dragging a body across a yard was a second in which he could be seen, heard, or interrupted. Killing the victim where she lay would have been faster, quieter, and far less risky. But he didn't do that. He moved her outside every time. In behavioral terms, when a killer repeatedly takes an action that increases his risk without increasing his chance of success, that action is almost certainly driven by the fantasy rather than the practicality of the crime. The dragging was not something he did to accomplish the murder. It was part of the experience he needed the murder to provide. Some criminal psychologists have interpreted this behavior as a need for a specific setting. The killer's fantasy did not take place inside a room. It took place outside, in the open, in the dirt. The cabin was where he found the victim. The yard was where he enacted whatever scene had been playing in his mind long before he ever entered the first window. This would explain why the behavior was so consistent. It wasn't a practical choice that varied based on circumstances. It was a requirement, something the killer could not skip, no matter how much risk it added, because without it the act was incomplete. The second signature behavior was the insertion of objects into the victim's ears. 6 of the murdered women were found with a sharp object, an iron rod, a thin spike, or something similar, driven into one or both of their ears. This was not a cause of death in most cases. The victims had already been struck with an axe. The rod in the ears came after. It was something the killer did to the body during or after the assault as a separate and deliberate act. Of all the details in this case, this is the one that has resisted explanation the longest. Some researchers have suggested it was a form of symbolic silencing, an attempt to destroy the victim's ability to hear, as if the killer were sealing off the senses of a person who was already dead or dying. Others have interpreted it as a form of additional penetration, an extension of the sexual assault carried out through a different means, driven by the same compulsion but expressed in a way that is harder to categorize. Still others have noted that the insertion of objects into the body after death is sometimes associated with what criminal psychologists call picarism, a paraphilia in which the act of piercing or puncturing skin produces sexual arousal. In cases where picarism is present, the specific location of the wound often carries personal significance for the killer, even if that significance is incomprehensible to anyone else. What all of these interpretations share is the recognition that this behavior was not random. It was repeated too consistently, across too many crime scenes, to be anything other than a core part of the killer's psychological signature. It meant something to him. It was something he needed to do. And the fact that he did it to 6 of his victims suggests that it was not an afterthought. It may have been as important to him as the killing itself. The third signature behavior appeared only once, but it may be the most psychologically revealing detail in the entire case. On Christmas Eve, after Eula Phillips was killed and left in the alley behind the Phillips home, the killer placed 3 pieces of firewood across her body, 2 across her chest and 1 across her stomach. Her arms were outstretched. Nothing like this had appeared at any of the earlier crime scenes. In criminal psychology, when a new behavior appears late in a series of offenses, it usually means one of 2 things. Either the killer's fantasy is evolving and demanding new forms of expression, or the circumstances of this particular crime triggered something that the earlier crimes had not. Eula Phillips was different from every other victim in the series. She was white, she was young, she was wealthy, she was beautiful, and she was found in a neighborhood that would have been foreign territory for the killer if, as most evidence suggests, he was a young black man from the freedmen's communities on the other side of the city. The positioning of her body, the wood across her chest and stomach, the arms spread wide, has been described by some researchers as ritualistic. Others have called it ceremonial. Whatever word is used, the intent is clear. The killer was not simply leaving a body behind. He was composing something, arranging it, creating a scene that existed for no audience other than himself. This is consistent with what behavioral analysts call staging. The killer is not trying to mislead investigators or create a false narrative. He is fulfilling an internal need. The scene he creates is the final expression of the fantasy that drove the crime in the first place. And then there is the watch. On the night Gracie Vance was killed, the killer broke into a separate home, scattered the belongings of a Swedish servant girl, and stole a silver open-faced watch that her father had given her. He then carried the watch with him to the attack on Gracie Vance's household, and after murdering Gracie and leaving her body in the dirt beside the stable, he wrapped the watch around her wrist. He didn't keep it, he didn't pawn it, he gave it to a dead woman. This is perhaps the single strangest detail in the entire case. It serves no practical function whatsoever. It is not part of the assault, it is not part of the killing. It is an entirely separate act, the theft of a personal object from one location and the deliberate placement of that object on a victim at another location. In cases where killers take objects from one scene and leave them at another, behavioral analysts sometimes describe it as a form of linking behavior. The killer is creating a connection between two events that exists only in his mind. He is weaving his crimes together into a personal narrative that no one else can read. Others have interpreted the placement of the watch as a form of gifting, a distorted act of affection or ownership, in which the killer gives something to the victim as though she belongs to him. The honest answer is that we don't know what it meant. We may never know. But like the dragging, like the rods in the ears, like the wood across Eula Phillips' body, the watch tells us something fundamental about the person who did this. He was not simply killing. He was performing something, a private ritual that followed the violence, and that may have been just as important to him as the violence itself. Each murder was not just an act of destruction. It was, for the killer, an act of creation. He was building something in those yards and alleys in the middle of the night, something that only he could see, something that only he could understand. And when it was finished, he disappeared into the darkness and left it behind for the rest of the world to find. There is a detail in this case that is easy to overlook because it is defined by what didn't happen rather than what did. The midnight assassin encountered children at multiple crime scenes over the course of 1885. Eliza Shelley's 3 boys were in the cabin when their mother was killed. The oldest was 7. Douglas Brown, Irene Cross's 12-year-old nephew, was sleeping in the next room when the killer entered with a knife. Mary Ramey, 11 years old, was taken from the room where her mother lay unconscious. Eula Phillips' infant son, Thomas, was in the bed when his mother and father were attacked. In every one of these cases, the killer could have killed the children. They were witnesses. Some of them were old enough to give descriptions. Leaving them alive was, from a purely practical standpoint, the most dangerous thing the killer did. And yet he didn't harm them, not once. He did more than simply ignore them. He interacted with them. He woke Eliza Shelley's 7-year-old son, placed a blanket over his head, told him to keep still, and warned him not to look. Then he told the boy a lie that he was leaving for St. Louis on the first train in the morning, as if offering a reason for his presence that the child might accept. He entered Douglas Brown's room, looked at the boy, told him quietly that he wasn't there to hurt him, and warned him not to scream. Then he walked calmly into the next room and murdered Douglas's aunt. He left Eula Phillips' infant son sitting in a bed soaked with his parents' blood, unharmed, holding a piece of apple that someone had placed in his hand. These are not the actions of a man in an uncontrollable frenzy. A killer who is lost in rage does not stop to soothe a child. He does not take the time to find an apple, place it in an infant's hand, and move on to the next room. He does not whisper instructions to a 12-year-old boy with the calm authority of someone who is fully aware of what he is doing and fully in command of how he is doing it. The children were spared deliberately, and the way they were spared with something that resembled care, or at least a distorted version of it, tells us something important about the structure of the killer's mind. In criminal psychology, there is a concept called compartmentalization. It describes the ability to hold 2 contradictory psychological states at the same time, to be capable of extreme violence in one moment and something resembling tenderness in the next, without experiencing any internal conflict between the two. The midnight assassin appears to have compartmentalized completely when it came to children. His violence was not indiscriminate, it was targeted. The rage that drove him to drag women from their beds, assault them, and mutilate their bodies did not extend to the children who were present during those same attacks. This tells us that the killer's violence was not about destruction for its own sake. It was specific. It was aimed at a particular category of person, women, and specifically women, who occupied a particular role in his psychological world. The children fell outside that category so completely that the killer could interact with them gently, almost protectively, in the same minutes that he was committing acts of extraordinary brutality against their mothers. This level of compartmentalization is consistent with what researchers call the anger retaliatory offender profile. In this profile, the killer's violence is driven by accumulated rage toward a specific type of person, almost always women, and almost always women who represent, consciously or unconsciously, someone from the killer's own life: a mother, a caretaker, a woman who held authority over him during a period when he was powerless. The killing is not about the individual victim, it is about what she represents. She is a stand-in for the original source of the killer's rage, a source he cannot confront directly, either because she is no longer accessible or because the power dynamic that defined their relationship still holds him in its grip. The children did not represent that source. They were not part of the fantasy, and because they were not part of the fantasy, the killer had no use for them, which, in this case, meant they were allowed to live. There is something deeply unsettling about this, and it goes beyond the obvious horror of a man who murders women and spares children. It is the fact that the mercy was real. The blanket over the boy's head was not a strategic decision. Covering a child's face is not an effective way to prevent him from identifying you later. It is the kind of thing you do when you don't want a child to see something terrible. The apple given to the infant was not a practical measure. An 18-month-old child is not going to raise an alarm. Giving him something to hold is the kind of thing you do to comfort a baby who might otherwise start crying, not because the crying threatens your escape, but because some part of you cannot tolerate the sound of a frightened child. The quiet voice used with Douglas Brown, the reassurance that the man was not there to hurt him, was not necessary. A 12-year-old boy confronted by an intruder in the middle of the night is not going to fight. The reassurance was offered because the killer, for reasons that existed deep within his own psychology, needed the boy to know that he was not in danger. These moments suggest that the midnight assassin was not a man without feeling. He was a man whose feelings operated on a fractured and deeply distorted map. Women who resembled whoever had caused him pain received the full force of his rage. Children who apparently did not trigger that rage received something that looked almost like compassion. Both responses were genuine. Both existed inside the same person, operating simultaneously without apparent contradiction. This is what makes the anger retaliatory profile so difficult for most people to comprehend. The killer is not a monster in the way that word is usually understood, a creature without human emotion, driven purely by cruelty. He is something more complicated than that. He is a person whose emotions are intact but profoundly misdirected. A person who can feel protectiveness toward a child and murderous hatred toward the child's mother in the same 60 seconds. The children of the servant girl annihilator's victims survived because the killer's rage had a specific address. It was not meant for them. It was meant for someone else, someone whose face he may have seen every time he looked at the women he destroyed. On the night of the 28th of September, 1885, Lucinda Body became the only person to confront the midnight assassin face to face and survive. She had been struck in the head along with everyone else in Gracie Vance's cabin. She should have been dead, or at least unconscious for the rest of the night, but she woke up. She found a kerosene lantern, lit it, and looked around the room. Orange Washington was on the floor, and standing in the cabin, still there, was a man. When the light hit him, he didn't attack her. He didn't run. Instead, he said 3 words, "Don't look at me." Then he cursed at her and told her to put out the light. Lucinda threw the lantern at him and ran screaming into the yard. That moment, brief, chaotic, and half-lit by a kerosene flame, is one of the most psychologically significant details in the entire case. It is significant not because of what Lucinda did, but because of what the killer said. He had just murdered 2 people. He had attacked 4. He was standing in a room full of blood, holding whatever weapon he had used, with no reason to believe that anyone was going to stop him. And the thing that disturbed him was being seen. Not being caught, not being chased, but being looked at. There is an important difference between a killer who flees from a witness because he is afraid of identification and a killer who recoils from being observed because the act of being seen disrupts something inside him. The first is a practical response, the second is a psychological one. The Midnight Assassin's command, "Don't look at me," was not strategic. If his concern had been identification, the rational response would have been to attack Lucinda immediately, before she could take in any details about his appearance. She was injured, disoriented, and holding a light source that made her an easy target. Instead, he told her not to look. This suggests that the killer experienced being seen as a form of psychological exposure that he could not tolerate, not because it threatened his freedom, but because it threatened the internal state he had constructed for himself inside that room. In criminal psychology, there is a concept sometimes called the mask of the offender. It refers to the psychological barrier that certain killers maintain between their sense of self and the acts they commit. Some killers operate in a dissociative state during their crimes. They are present physically, but some part of their consciousness has separated from what they are doing. The violence is real, but it feels distant, as if it is happening to someone else or being performed by someone else. This dissociative barrier is fragile. It can be maintained in darkness, in silence, in the absence of any external awareness, but it can be shattered by something as simple as being looked at by another human being. The moment another person's eyes meet the killer's, the separation collapses. He is no longer a figure operating in the dark, unseen and untethered from ordinary reality. He is a man standing in a room full of the people he has just destroyed, and someone is watching him do it. The command, "Don't look at me," may have been the Midnight Assassin's attempt to preserve that barrier, to keep the mask intact, to prevent the collision between what he was doing and who he understood himself to be. This interpretation is consistent with other details in the case. The killer operated exclusively at night. He attacked only sleeping victims. He entered through windows and moved through rooms in darkness. He wore a cloth over his face during at least one of the attacks. Eliza Shelley's son described a man with a white rag over his face with 2 holes cut for eyes. Every one of these behaviors reduces the chance of being seen, but they also serve a secondary function. They reduce the chance of the killer seeing himself. In the dark, with a mask on, attacking people who are unconscious, the killer is invisible not just to the world, but to his own reflection. He exists in a space where the ordinary rules of identity do not apply. He can do things in that space that the person he is during the day could not do, because in that space, the person he is during the day does not exist. Lucinda Body's lantern destroyed that space in an instant. Light entered the room, eyes met, and the killer's first instinct was not violence, it was a plea not to look at him. It is worth comparing this moment to a detail from the Villisca Axe murders, which occurred 27 years later and over 1,000 miles away. In Villisca, the killer covered every mirror in the house after murdering 8 people. He draped clothing and blankets over any reflective surface he could find. He could not tolerate seeing himself in the context of what he had done. The Midnight Assassin could not tolerate being seen by someone else in that same context. The underlying psychology may be the same. Both behaviors suggest a killer who is capable of extreme violence, but who cannot fully integrate that violence into his conscious identity. He can do it, but he cannot witness himself doing it, and he cannot allow anyone else to witness it either. This is not weakness, it is not hesitation. It is a specific psychological structure, a mind that has divided itself into compartments, with the violence sealed inside one compartment and the killer's sense of self sealed inside another. As long as those compartments remain separate, the killer can function. He can move through the crime. He can carry out his ritual. He can interact with children gently and murder their mothers brutally in the span of a few minutes. But the moment those compartments are breached by a lantern, by a pair of eyes, by a mirror, the whole structure is threatened. Lucinda Body, half conscious and bleeding from a wound to her head, did something that night that the entire Austin police force could not do in a full year of investigation. She made the killer flinch, not because she was a physical threat, but because she held up a light and looked at him, and in that moment, he could not bear what he saw. Eight people were murdered over the course of a single year in a city of 17,000. The crimes followed the same method. The victims were attacked in their beds at night, struck with an axe, dragged into backyards, sexually assaulted, and left with similar wounds, including, in multiple cases, a sharp object driven into their ears. The barefoot prints found at the scenes shared the same unusual feature. The bloodhounds failed in the same way every time. The killer left witnesses alive at nearly every scene, and those witnesses described similar experiences: a man in the dark, a calm voice, a command not to look or scream. From a modern perspective, the pattern is obvious. The consistency across the crime scenes, the shared modus operandi, the repeated signature behaviors, all of it points clearly to a single offender committing a series of related crimes. No one in Austin in 1885 saw it that way. The police treated each murder as a separate case. After each attack, they arrested a boyfriend, a husband, a neighbor, or simply the nearest black man who couldn't account for his whereabouts. The idea that one person might be responsible for all of the killings was not just dismissed, it was actively resisted by the city's most powerful officials. According to Texas Monthly, powerful elected officials refused to believe that one man, or one group of men, was responsible for all the murders. This was not simply a failure of policing, it was a failure of perception, and the reasons for that failure run deeper than incompetence or limited resources. The first reason is that the concept of a serial killer did not exist. The term would not be coined for nearly another century. In 1885, there was no framework, no vocabulary, no criminal theory, no precedent for understanding that a single individual could murder strangers repeatedly, over an extended period, driven by an internal compulsion rather than a personal motive. Every model of murder that existed in the minds of Austin's investigators was based on relationships. People killed people they knew for reasons that could be understood: jealousy, money, revenge, drunken rage. The idea that someone could kill a person he had never met for reasons that existed entirely inside his own psychology was not part of the mental equipment available to anyone working the case. Without that concept, the pattern was invisible. Each murder looked like a separate event with a separate cause, because that was the only kind of murder anyone had ever heard of. The second reason is that racial bias shaped every aspect of the investigation in ways that made the pattern even harder to see. For the first 11 months of the killing, every victim was black. In the Austin of 1885, crimes against black citizens, particularly black women working as domestic servants, did not receive the same investigative attention as crimes against white citizens. The police response to each murder was brief, underfunded, and driven more by the desire to make a quick arrest than by any sustained effort to understand what had happened. Black men were rounded up by the hundreds, suspects were beaten, confessions were coerced under threat of lynching, and once an arrest was made, any arrest, the investigation effectively ended, regardless of whether the evidence supported it. This meant that each case was closed, at least in the minds of the authorities, before anyone had the chance to notice that the same thing kept happening. The racial dynamics also shaped the theories that investigators were willing to consider. When the victims were black servants, the police assumed the killers were black men with personal connections to the victims. When the two white women were murdered on Christmas Eve, the police assumed their husbands had done it and staged the scenes to look like the earlier attacks. In both cases, the investigators reached for the explanation that was most consistent with their existing assumptions about how the world worked, assumptions that were shaped as much by racial ideology as by criminal logic. The possibility that a single killer was targeting women across racial lines was not just unlikely in the minds of Austin's white authorities, it was unthinkable. It would have required them to accept that a crime against a black servant woman and a crime against a wealthy white woman were fundamentally the same act, committed by the same person for the same reasons. In 1885, that was a connection that the social order of Austin was not built to make. In psychology, there is a well-documented phenomenon called confirmation bias. It describes the tendency of the human mind to seek out, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm what it already believes. When investigators already believed that each murder was a separate crime committed by someone known to the victim, every piece of evidence they encountered was filtered through that belief. A jealous ex-boyfriend, that confirms the theory. A husband with a drinking problem, that confirms the theory. A letter written by a wife who was thinking about leaving, that confirms the theory. The barefoot prints with the missing toe appearing at scene after scene. That detail was noted but never publicly connected across the cases, because connecting it would have challenged the theory that the investigators had already committed to. Confirmation bias does not require malice or stupidity. It operates automatically, beneath conscious awareness, in the minds of intelligent and well-meaning people. It is one of the most powerful distortions in human cognition, and it is especially dangerous in criminal investigations, where the pressure to make an arrest can override the patience required to see a pattern clearly. In Austin in 1885, confirmation bias and racial bias reinforced each other in a way that made the investigation almost structurally incapable of solving the case. The police were looking for individual killers with individual motives because that was what they believed murder looked like. The victims were treated as separate cases because their race and social status made it easy to dismiss them as unrelated. And the one piece of physical evidence that might have tied the scenes together, the distinctive footprint, was kept secret from the public and apparently never used to connect the crimes in any systematic way. By the time the Christmas Eve murders forced the city to take the case seriously, it was too late. The physical evidence from the earlier crime scenes had not been preserved in any meaningful way. The suspects who had been arrested and released left behind no useful records. The bloodhounds had never picked up a trail. The investigation had not merely failed to find the killer. It had failed to recognize that there was a single killer to find. And this failure was not unique to Austin. It was a reflection of the time, the place, and the limits of what the human mind could see when it had no framework for understanding what it was looking at. The midnight assassin operated in a gap between what was happening and what anyone was equipped to comprehend. He killed in a world that had not yet invented the concept of the thing he was. And by the time that concept arrived, decades later, the evidence was gone, the witnesses were dead, and the only thing left was the pattern itself, visible at last, but far too late to matter. More than 140 years have passed since the night of the 24th of December, 1885. No one was ever convicted. Every suspect was either acquitted, cleared, killed in an unrelated incident, or simply faded from the investigation without resolution. The killer, whoever he was never identified. The police files from the investigation were eventually destroyed. The crime scenes are gone. The backyard cabins where the victims lived and died were torn down long ago. And yet the case refuses to disappear. Books are still written about it, documentaries are still produced. In 2014, more than 129 years after the last murder, PBS devoted an entire episode of History Detectives to re-examining the evidence with modern forensic techniques. The house where Eula Phillips was murdered no longer stands. Neither does the cabin where Mollie Smith was killed, or the shed where Mary Ramey died. But the moonlight towers that the city erected in response to the murders are still there, rising 165 feet above the streets of Austin, casting their glow over neighborhoods that have been rebuilt and renamed and transformed beyond recognition. Most people who pass beneath them have no idea what they are or why they were built. But the towers remain, and so does the story. The question is why, not why the murders happened. That is a question for forensic psychology, and we have spent the better part of this video trying to answer it. The question is why this case still has a hold on people after all this time, why it keeps being revisited, re-examined, and retold, why the name Servant Girl Annihilator still carries a weight that far exceeds what most people know about the actual events. The answer has to do with how the human brain processes stories that never end. In psychology, there is a well-known principle called the Zeigarnik effect. It was first described in the 1920s by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who observed that people remember uncompleted tasks far better than completed ones. The explanation is that when a task or a narrative reaches its conclusion, the brain files it away. The mental tension around it dissolves because there is nothing left to resolve. The story is finished. The brain lets it go. But when something remains unfinished, when the ending never arrives, the brain keeps it active. It stays in an open loop, taking up mental resources, periodically resurfacing, demanding attention. This is why a song stuck in your head is almost always one that was interrupted before the end. It is why cliffhangers work. It is why you can remember the details of an argument that was never resolved far more vividly than one that was. The Servant Girl Annihilator case is one of the oldest open loops in American criminal history. 8 people were killed. The crimes were described in extensive detail. Suspects were identified, investigated, arrested, and tried. And then nothing happened, no conviction, no definitive answer, no ending. The brain cannot accept that. It keeps returning to the case, turning it over, re-examining the suspects, looking for the detail that might finally close the loop. And it can't find one because there is no ending to find. This is compounded by a second psychological phenomenon that is specific to violent crime. When a murder is solved, the fear it generates gets attached to a specific person. The killer is given a name, a face, a history. He becomes a contained threat, something the brain can categorize and file under a label. This is who did it. This is why. This is how he was caught. The threat is reduced from something vast and unknown to something specific and understood. And once that happens, the brain can process it, store it, and move on. When a murder is unsolved, the fear has nowhere to land. The killer remains abstract. He has no name, no face, no story. He is a shape in the dark, defined only by what he did and by the fact that no one ever found out who he was. And because he was never identified, the brain cannot fully process him as a resolved threat. He remains open, uncontained, still out there in the psychological sense, even if he has been dead for over a century. This is why unsolved cases feel different from solved ones. It is not just the absence of justice, it is the absence of containment. The fear was never given a box to fit inside. It was never reduced to a name and a motive and a sentence. It was left loose, and it has remained loose for 140 years. In the case of the Servant Girl Annihilator, this effect is amplified by something else, the Jack the Ripper connection. The theory that the Austin killer and Jack the Ripper were the same person has never been proven. The evidence for it is thin at best. A Malaysian cook who may or may not have worked at a hotel near the crime scenes. A set of superficial similarities between the two sets of murders. A newspaper editor in Atlanta who suggested the idea in 1888 and whose speculation took on a life of its own. But the theory has persisted for over 130 years, and it shows no sign of fading. The reason is not that the evidence supports it. The reason is that the human brain finds it almost irresistible. There is a psychological phenomenon called apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. It is the engine behind conspiracy theories, superstitions, and pattern recognition gone wrong. When the brain is confronted with two unsolved mysteries that share surface-level similarities, the temptation to connect them is enormous. Linking the Midnight Assassin to Jack the Ripper doesn't just create a more dramatic story. It does something the brain desperately wants. It reduces two open loops to one. If the same man committed both sets of murders, then there is only one mystery to solve instead of two. The narrative becomes simpler. The unknowns collapse into a single question: who was he? Instead of remaining as two separate, unrelated voids. The grander the theory, the more satisfying it feels, even when the evidence is thinnest. Because the satisfaction doesn't come from the evidence. It comes from the relief of having fewer unanswered questions. This is why the Jack the Ripper connection continues to appear in nearly every account of the Servant Girl Annihilator, despite the fact that most serious researchers consider it unlikely. It is not being kept alive by evidence. It is being kept alive by the brain's refusal to tolerate two unsolved cases when one unified theory could explain them both. And beneath all of this, the Zeigarnik effect, the uncontained fear, the apophenia, there is something more fundamental about why the Servant Girl Annihilator case endures. It is about what the murders revealed about the place where they happened. Austin in 1885 was a city that believed it was becoming modern. It was building a capital. It was educating its children. It was paving its streets and stringing telephone wires and constructing the architecture of a civilized future. And then something came out of the dark and showed the city that none of that mattered. The locks didn't help, the police couldn't stop it, the bloodhounds couldn't track it, the courts couldn't convict anyone, the 400 arrests produced nothing. Everything the city had built, every institution, every authority, every system designed to keep people safe, failed completely against a single individual who entered homes at night and destroyed the people inside them. The Moonlight Towers were Austin's final answer. If the institutions couldn't stop the killer, then the city would try to eliminate the conditions he needed to operate. It would flood the streets with artificial light and hope that was enough. It is a monument to a very specific kind of desperation, the desperation of a community that has exhausted every rational response to a threat and has turned, in the end, to something that resembles magical thinking. If we make the city bright enough, maybe the darkness won't come back. The towers are still there. They still glow at night over streets that have been renamed and rebuilt many times over. And the case is still open. Not in any official sense, there is no investigation, no file, no detective assigned to it. But in the psychological sense, the case has never closed. The loop was never completed. The killer was never named. And somewhere in the back of every person who reads about this case or listens to this story, the same quiet recognition surfaces. They never found out who did it, and now they never will. That thought has no resolution, and that is exactly why it never goes away. If you've made it this far, I'm curious. Do you think Nathan Elgin was the midnight assassin? Do you think it was the Malay cook who vanished in January of 1886? Do you think the killer boarded a steamer, crossed the Atlantic, and became Jack the Ripper? Or do you think it was someone whose name was never written down, someone who lived and died in Austin without anyone ever knowing what he had done? Leave a comment and let me know, but for now, have a good rest.